so far it's been the fox and the cat, and they're kind of two-bit hoods, and so the pathological pathway that they offer Pinocchio is not the worst of the pathological pathways. But here, at least as far as the imagination, the collective imagination that created this movie is concerned, this is where you get to the most pathological form of, let's call it temptation. And that's the temptation to engage in, to abandon responsibility and to engage in impulsive pleasure seeking, short-term pleasure seeking. So here's the fox pretending to be a doctor, investigating Pinocchio's illness, and he makes some notes, which is all just meaningless scribble, right? It's like white noise, and it doesn't matter that the arguments that he's making are completely incoherent, and it doesn't matter that he actually doesn't know anything. What he's selling is easy to buy, and so Pinocchio buys it. And by the end of the conversation with the fox, he's pretty convinced that he's useless and that he needs a vacation. This is an edible situation as well, which I touched on in the other lecture. I mean, let's imagine that you have a child that is a little on the neurotic side, so high negative emotion, and maybe one that's also a little bit on the sickly side, so has a variety of, let's say, relatively minor ailments, but ailments nonetheless. And so what that means as a parent, we'll say mother for this example because I want to use the Oedipal example, you have to make a decision all the time about exactly how you're going to treat that child. One decision is, well, you don't have to go to school today because you're not feeling well. It's like, fair enough. But do you make the same decision the next day? And do you make the same decision the next day? And let's imagine that you enable the child to avoid responsibility as a consequence of capitalizing on their illness. Well, then that's not going to be very good for the child. The rule with a sickly child has to be something like, I'm going to push you right to your limit. Because otherwise, how is the person going to figure out what they can do? And if they can't figure out what they can do, then they're not going to be able to make their way in the world at all. And then that gets muddied very badly if you're not exactly sure that you want them to make their way in the world. Maybe you're just as happy because you'd be sitting at home alone if your child was there with you. And maybe you'd be just as happy at some level if they never grew up at all, because then they won't leave. And maybe that's because you have a terrible marriage and you're lonesome. Maybe it's an abusive marriage and your husband has chased away all your friends, and so you don't have anything at all. And maybe that's because you didn't stand up for yourself very well, apart from the fact that he was, tyrannical in his central nature. And so then all those little warps and bends in your psyche are going to manifest themselves right in the background of every single one of those decisions. My daughter had a lot of illnesses when she was adolescent, and they were very serious, and it was very difficult to figure out what to do about that, because you couldn't exactly apply normative rules, right? And we always had to figure out, if she was communicating her symptoms to us, how seriously to take those. And the answer was the least amount of serious possible. It's something like that, because we needed to know, and she needed to know, what she could do in spite of the fact that she had problems. And one of the things I really tried to instill in her, and I think it worked, is that you don't ever want to use your illness as an excuse for not doing anything. Not consciously. Sometimes you might not know, I'm not feeling well, what can I do? Well, you don't know, right? Because sometimes when you're not feeling well, you can do more than you think, and sometimes you can do less than you think. It's not like it's obvious, but sometimes it's obvious. This little temptation flits through your mind and you think, well, I don't really want to do what I'm doing today, and I'm not feeling very well, so I don't have to do it. You do that 100 times, then you don't know how sick you are anymore. And then you're in real trouble, because not only are you sick, but you've muddied the waters. And so you have both problems then, is you're actually ill and you've betrayed yourself by using that as an excuse not to pursue your responsibilities. And that, I think, if you do both of those things happen to you at the same time, you're in real trouble. And it's really hard not to have that happen. So anyways, Pinocchio gets enticed into believing that he's a victim. The fact that he's insufficient is used as an excuse by the fox and the cat to offer him a trip to Pleasure Island. And this is, I think, where the movie gets particularly dark. And so off they go, singing away. They have to carry him. So you could say, in some sense, he's carried by societal pathology and his own trouble. He's carried like a puppet off to Pleasure Island. And so the cricket is again left behind. He's not the world's best conscience at this point. So Pinocchio goes off to meet the coachman, and the coachman has already said he's collecting bad little boys, and he's got them all in the coach. They're all delinquent types here, and the ticket on the coach was the ace of spades, which is what Pinocchio is holding, and he's with this character here called Lampwick. That's an interesting name. So he's the thing that burns in the middle of a light, Lampwick. And that's interesting because it's a play on Lucifer, because Lucifer means bringer of light. And so Lampwick is a play on that. And Lampwick is really a nasty piece of work. He's got this false arrogance about him. He's got this like cynical voice, really deeply cynical voice. And he's only, I don't know how old he's supposed to be in this, maybe 12 or something like that, or 13. And so he's one of those kids who's become prematurely cynical. I'll tell you a story about that. So I used to live in Montreal. I lived in a poor neighborhood. And one day I was out in the back alley building a fence, because I was putting a little fence around my little tiny backyard. And there was a house across the alley down the street a ways where there was a lot of like not good partying. A lot of bikers were hanging around there. And I knew there was a little kid that lived there as well. Anyways, I was out there in the back alley pounding away on my fence, and these little kids came up, and they were little. They were like 3 and 4 years old, hey? And they spoke Joual, right, kind of really heavily accented Quebecois French, and so my French isn't good, so I could hardly understand them, but they were watching me hammer, and they got a little closer, and they had one kid who was clearly the leader, had a real scowl on his face, hey? And so they were watching, and I kind of motioned to one of them that they could use the hammer. And that kid said, and I'm going to mangle this, but he said, je volais, or something like that. And what it meant is, I'll steal that. And so I thought, and then he came over and he tugged on it, and he wanted me to take it. And he was quite angry, and, well, I wasn't going to let him take it. And then so I couldn't engage him. I couldn't get him to play, and his buddies were sort of hanging around behind him, and they wouldn't come and play because he wouldn't. And so he was hostile right away to me. And then, so the fence piece was laying out in the alley, and these little monsters started running across it, which I thought was really remarkable, but it was terrible at the same time because they were really little kids. That shouldn't be happening when you're like 3 or 4. If that's happening at that age, things are not good. And so that kid was already like seriously not happy with the world. And I'd been studying antisocial behavior for a long time by that point, and I knew that the kids who are destined to jail later in their lives are kids who are rough and tough when they're 2 years old, but then don't get socialized, or maybe worse, they get anti-socialized, which is exactly what happened to this kid. He'd obviously been ignored and abused. Certainly no one had ever played with him in any real way because he wouldn't play. And it's not good if a kid is that little and you can't get them to play. Something's gone seriously wrong, because they're so playful at that age that it's like 90% of them. Anyway, so they were running back and forth on this fence. I thought, stomping on it, and I was right there. I thought, well, first of all, I thought that was remarkable, but I also thought it was absolutely horrifying because, in some sense I could see where this kid was headed and why at that early stage in his life. It's not a pleasant thing to behold, but there was nothing that could be done about it. And that's kind of what this Lampwick is like. He's prematurely cynical. This kid was already cynical, and he was like 4 years old. Most kids don't get cynical till they're teenagers, and then often they don't get completely cynical, and usually they more or less grow out of it. But it had happened to him much earlier. So this Lampwick character, he's already decided that he knows everything, that everyone else's opinion is worth nothing, and that there's nothing in culture or society that holds any utility whatsoever for someone like him. Now, you can imagine developing that way if you were raised in a family where people were generally lying to you and that they randomly treated you or neglected you, and that you couldn't discern anything about them that was admirable or positive. You know, of course you'd assume that the whole structure is corrupt and that you had to take care of yourself and no one else. Well, not of course. Not everyone assumes that under those situations. I shouldn't say of course. But it's a logical set of conclusions. So, and of course it's proportionate to some degree to how much abuse you take. Although there are lots of stories of people who've been terribly abused as children who grew up to be, you know, kind, remarkable, responsible, thoughtful people who were absolutely opposed to abuse instead of propagating it. There's no direct causal pathway. Anyways, Lampwick is pretty happy to be on this coach way to Pleasure Island, which he's heard about. He said, well, it's all you can eat, it's all you can smoke, you don't have to do any work, and you can do anything you want. So you might say, well, it's too good to be true. Like the gingerbread house in the Hansel and Gretel story, right? The kids are lost, there's a gingerbread house. It's a house, which is something they need, and it's made out of cookies. It looks like it's a little bit too good to be true. And of course, in the house, there's the negative part of that, which is the old witch who wants to eat children. And that's a story about what happens to people if they're offered more than they should be offered. So, anyways, Lampwick is firing off, he has a little slingshot and he's firing off pebbles at the horses who are pulling the carriage, and that's just kind of the guy that he is. So he takes Pinocchio under his wing, and the cricket is down there in the dust. He's caught back up to the carriage, but he's having a rough time at this point. And this is also a story to some degree about the transition into adolescence. You know, because adolescence is a time people are still pretty impulsive and their view is quite short term, and they're more likely to pursue immediate pleasures and all of that, and that can get really out of hand. So anyways, they separate from the mainland and go on a boat, and so they're off to Pleasure Island, dark place. And the coachman opens the gates and lets the delinquents into Pleasure Island, and they basically have a riot. And this is Pleasure Island here. It's full of amusement park rides, and you know, one of the things that's kind of interesting about horror movies, I'm sure you've noticed this, is that they're often set at amusement parks, and clowns are often characters of horror. We'll leave the clowns aside for now, but the amusement park thing, that's pretty interesting. It's like, why in the world would an amusement park be a place of horror? And the first question might be, well, have you ever been to an amusement park? Because there is something about them that's really, they have a dark side, a clear dark side. And part of it is that people with nothing better to do are spending money stupidly, and they're being fleeced by the people who operate the amusement park. You know, and they have, let's say, a stereotypically dark reputation, and they're moving around all the time, which is also something that psychopaths do, and all they're doing is moving from community to community and taking the money from the rubes, fundamentally. And so, the amusement park, well, if you walk through an amusement park with that sort of thing in mind, maybe that's also coloring your vision, of course, but it's something that you can see very immediately. So there's something about them that's sort of deeply sad, but there's also there's an underlying horror that characterizes them, that it's easy for horror movie or horror novel writers to immediately expand upon, and there's something about it that makes sense to people. So it's too easy, maybe that's, and it's also all short-term gratification, that's the other thing. So you spend your money very rapidly and it's gone. Yep?
Well, it seems like a sort of a celebration of meanings divorced back from reality.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's the impulsive element. The comment was it's a celebration of meanings divorced from reality. Yeah, it's also outside of reality, right? That's why it's on an island. It's a separate universe. And it's a universe where nothing that's happening is connected to anything outside. And you're spending your hard-earned money, let's say, but it isn't that much, it's certainly not an investment. It's not that much different than burning it. Well, it is, because of course you get some pleasure out of it, but it isn't, going there every day is probably not the wisest move that you could make. So the animators do a good job of presenting the, what would you call it, the enforced hedonism, I guess I would say, of a place like that. This is a place where you're going to have fun. That's what it's for. So anyways, Lampwick, who's got this very arrogant look on his face and this kind of strut, it's a bravado, that's what that's called. It's a false confidence, and it's the sort of thing that people do when they're trying to impress upon others that they're high in the dominance hierarchy, but really they're not. So it's a mimicry of dominance, but it's something that can be intimidating, there's no doubt about it. I had a friend, he didn't come to a good end, this person. He was a real good friend of mine when I was in junior high and high school, and he was kind of crazy. And he was tall, he was about 6'7", and he was pretty thin. And we used to go out to the bar now and then, and in many of the bars that we lived in this little town, there were bullies. And these were guys, and I worked in the bars, and I used to watch these guys, and they'd basically, there was a handful of them in town, pretty psychopathic types. And they'd go to the bar, and all they'd do is sit there and wait for someone to come in who they could beat up. And they knew who it was as soon as they walked in. That's actually why they were at the bar. And so they'd wait till someone came in who didn't look very confident and who could likely be intimidated by this sort of thing, and then they'd tell them to come outside for a fight, and if they didn't, well, then they'd of course make fun of them, and if they did, well, generally they'd beat them up. My friend kind of cottoned on to this trick, and he started going to bars, and every time that someone like that came near him, he'd go outside and fight with them. And one of the things he observed right away is that almost inevitably when he went outside with them, they'd shake hands and make friends. So as soon as and it was really remarkable watching him, because he wasn't a particularly physically powerful person, although he was extraordinarily tall. But he had started to play this game, and he did it for a long time. And I don't remember him ever actually having to fight. He just stared them down fundamentally. So it was a very interesting thing to watch. But it was an indication to me of exactly how shallow this kind of bravado bullying actually is. But people don't find that out because they won't stand up, and it's not surprising. But anyways, they load up on food. Pinocchio's carrying a pie and an ice cream cone simultaneously, and then they're off to have a fight. And Lampwick says something like, it's good to punch someone in the nose sometimes, just for the, I think he says, heck of it. And so Pinocchio adopts this strut, and in they go to the rough house. And then in the next scene, you see this model home up for destruction. It's quite an interesting scene symbolically. You see, in the middle of this house here, there's a stained glass window that has a mandala on it. We'll see it more clearly in a minute. And a mandala is a sacred symbol of the self. That's the Jungian interpretation. It's a symbol. It's very difficult to describe, but it's a symbol. Music is a mandala, except it's played out across time. So you could say that thing is the same as music, but it's kind of like a slice of music. It's the same idea. You know, sometimes you see those slow motion or sped up motion videos of a flower unfolding. It's the same idea. You can imagine that being set to music, and somehow that would make sense. And the mandala is like a symbol of the unfolding of being, or the source of meaning, or something like that. And it's also a symbol of the self. From the Jungian perspective. And so there you see it more clearly. The kids are starting to burn this place and to trash it, and they're dragging a grand piano down the stairs. The destruction of high culture, about which they're nothing but cynical, because they don't believe that hard work and sacrifice can produce something of any value, and they want to bring it down and destroy it. And that's partly because you can see this in the story of Cain and Abel. Abel is hardworking, and everyone likes him, and he makes the proper sacrifices, and so his life goes really well. And that's part of the reason that Cain hates him, and he's jealous and resentful. But worse than that, if you're around someone, if you're not doing very well, especially if that's your own fault, if you're not doing very well and you're around someone who's doing very well, it's very painful, because the mere fact of their being judges you. And so it's very easy to want to destroy that ideal, so that you don't have to live with the terrible consequences of seeing it embodied in front of you. And so part of the reason that people want to tear things down is so that they don't have anything to contrast themselves against and to feel bad, and that's exactly what's happening here. The kids are destroying all of this culture, roughly speaking, because it judges them. The fact that it exists judges them. And I've often thought this about Michelangelo's statue of David, which is this heroic, so David was a shepherd, obviously, and it doesn't sound like much, but back in those times, being a shepherd was a big deal because there were lions and you had a slingshot, and so like you got to defend your sheep from lions with a slingshot. So you weren't exactly this like 19th century English guy dressed in a, you know, frilly blue suit. You were tough as a bloody, well, as someone who would go after a lion with a slingshot. It's no joke. Anyways, the statue is very heroic, and you know, you look at that and you think, well, that's the possibility of humankind, but by the same token, it's also what you're not. And so, as well as being an ideal, it's a judge, and every ideal is a judge. So, yes?
Going back to your example of Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
So you're using that as an example to illustrate becoming bitter as a result of not being able to achieve
Sure.
Status as a result
Success even.
Success as a result of hard work. But
yeah.
in the example of Cain and Abel,
yeah.
Like one was a shepherd and the
yeah.
other was a farmer, and the one who
no, one is, yes, that's right. One,
and the
yes.
one who was a shepherd was the one who was favored.
Yes, that's right.
So was that a result of the hard work, or was that a result of
good question.
The
stories, well, that's a good question. Those stories are very, very complicated, and the story is very ambivalent about whether Cain is not rewarded because he makes bad sacrifices or because God's just in a bad mood. And I like that. If you read the story, I've read multiple translations of the story, and when Cain comes to God to complain, God basically tells him, look, buddy, before you go about criticizing the structure of reality, you should look to your own inadequacies. He says, sin crouches at your door like a predatory, sexually aroused animal, and you invited it in to have its way with you, and something has emerged as a consequence. So don't be bothering me about my creation before you look to yourself. So there's a very strong hint that the reason that God has not favored Cain's sacrifices is because they weren't of particularly good quality. So, but it is ambivalent in the story, and there is the shepherd versus farmer motif as well. And of course that motif runs through the whole entire corpus of stories to some degree, especially the shepherd motif. So it's only about a paragraph long, that whole story, and it packs all that into that tiny little amount of space. But the idea that Cain kills Abel to get rid of his ideal and also to punish God, roughly speaking, it's a brilliant story. I mean, these guys who go around shooting up high schools, or shooting up high schools in particular, but you know, they're definitely out for revenge, and what they're revenging themselves against or to who is not exactly clear. Anyway, so these kids are just tearing down this model home, tearing down Western civilization, I suppose is another way of looking at it, or just tearing down civilization, period. And Pinocchio's having a pretty good time. He's got his axe and he's looking a little malevolent there, and happy to be destroying things, which is of course a pretty simple thing to do. So there's that image that I told you about, the mandala, and that's a flower in this image. And so what happens is that I think it's Lampwick throws a brick through it. And so what that means symbolically is the self is a symbol of your potential, among very many other things. But by engaging in this sort of impulsive, destructive activity, Lampwick and Pinocchio are making it impossible for them to further their development. And they're doing that to some degree consciously. You know, they basically say to hell with it and toss a brick through this highest ideal, the thing through which light shines. So also that harkens back to the star as well. So anyways, the coachman is paying attention to all this, and he's actually pretty happy about the fact that these boys are so involved in their stupid amusements that they're not paying any attention to what's actually going on. And he calls these people out of the darkness, these creatures out of the darkness. So you get these black, you can hardly see them there, but they're black cloaked figures with glowing eyes, and they're shutting the door of the amusement park. And that's very interesting. It's an extraordinarily interesting happening. It's like, okay, so all of a sudden the amusement park is associated, we already know that the coachman is up to no good, but now he's got these minions that are faceless in some sense. They're clearly creatures of the night, and they're up to no good. And so you have the sense that the boys are being offered bread in circuses, roughly speaking, but there's a real reason for it. There's a manipulative reason for it. They're being enticed into a trap, and the doors are closed, and these underground beings are involved in the plot. And obviously the coachman understands this perfectly well. And so one of the ways to understand this is to think about what totalitarian states have to offer their populace and what they offer them. And this happened particularly as Rome declined, let's say. That's where the term bread and circuses originally came from, is that as the situation degenerates, then people have to be offered stupid amusements more and more frequently in order for them to ignore what's actually going on in the background. And, a war can be that kind of stupid amusement. Anyways, later that night, the entire place is completely devastated, and all we see is the wreckage of everything that was there before. And again, the cricket has got separated from Pinocchio, and so he's trying to find him, and Pinocchio ends up in this bar that's shaped like an 8-ball. 8-ball is kind of the random ball in pool. And anyways, he's inside the 8-ball, and he's shooting pool with Lampwick, and that's just another indication of wasting his time, basically. And you can see in the forefront there's some cards for gambling, and so he's engaged in these sort of, you might say, pointless, hedonic pursuits, and he's enticing Pinocchio along the same route. And so he teaches him to smoke first. That doesn't go very well. So Pinocchio takes a huge drag on a cigar, and it just about kills him. And when Lampwick asks him how he likes it, he shakes his head and says, that it was really quite good, but he's so sick that he can hardly stand up, and he's hallucinating double balls on the pool table. And then the cricket shows up and stands on the 8-ball and kind of gives one of those declamatory speeches again, because he still hasn't quite figured out that standing up proud and spouting off the rules isn't exactly the right way for the conscience to behave. And Lampwick picks him up by the scruff of the neck, roughly speaking, and first of all asks who he is. So obviously he's divorced from his own conscience, and then makes fun of Pinocchio for paying attention to this little bug. And that's kind of a nice indication of what happens in adolescence, because of course as the children move away from their parents and into their groups, especially when the groups are misbehaving, often what happens is that the other members of the group will torture a person who isn't willing to try something dangerous or foolish by making fun of the fact that they're, too attached to their conscience. And there's a positive element to that, because you should take some risks when you're a teenager and also later in life. And so if you won't take any risks, there's actually something wrong with you. But there's a negative element in that, teenagers do all sorts of stupid things, and perhaps it's amazing that we all live through it, actually, as far as I'm concerned. And some people take extraordinary risks, and they don't make it through at all, or they end up in the permanently antisocial population. And then they're, basically career criminals. 5% of the criminals commit 95% of the crimes. It's another Pareto distribution. So, anyways, Lampwick isn't going to listen to Pinocchio or to the cricket. He laughs at him with this kind of braying laugh, which is some foreshadowing, and the cricket gets all upset, puts his coat on backwards, and ends up dumped down a pool table hole and otherwise abused. And so he stomps on out of there. He tells Pinocchio that he can take care of himself, and he stomps on out of there. And so Pinocchio is left without the guidance of conscience, and the cricket is trying to figure out how to get off Pleasure Island. But he goes through the gates and he sees what's actually going on. And what's going on is that the coachman has this like slave boat down in the bowels of the island, and he's got all these black suited minions with the glowing eyes working for him, and they're rounding up what look like donkeys. And so they're beasts of burden, right? And so there's an idea here that if you pursue impulsive pleasure to the detriment of the development of your character, you're going to end up a beast of burden. You're going to end up a slave to a tyrant. And that's exactly right. And so, anyways, the cricket doesn't, you can see one of those black-suited horrors here hauling donkeys out of this crate, and one of them has a hat on. And they look very sad. And they're in different crates, and one of them says sold to the salt mines, and one says sold to the circus. And so they're shipped off to be slaves, roughly speaking. And they look very sad. And then one of them gets hauled out of a crate, and he's still got a hat. He has a hat on and a sweater, and he can still talk. He's a boy, it turns out, that's been half transformed into a jackass, a braying jackass, prior to being enslaved. And so that's another thing that's quite interesting about the story. You know, it also makes the case that if you replace your voice with stupid braying, that the probability that you're going to become enslaved by a tyrant is extraordinarily high. And I always can't help but think about ideologues in that manner. You know, Solzhenitsyn wrote about the radical left ideologues that got thrown in the Gulag archipelago. You know, so they were party stalwarts. This happened to a lot of people. True believers who were vacuumed up by the Stalinist machine and thrown into the Gulag anyways. And he said that those people suffered in some ways more than everyone else because, what did he say? They were bit by the beloved hand that fed them. And so the first while when they were in the camps, Solzhenitsyn really didn't know what to do with people like that, because on the one hand, well, they were in the camps and wasn't that awful, and they've been torn away from their families and, you know, stripped of all their identity and their status, and so that's pretty rough. But on the other hand, they were writing letters protesting their innocence and assuming that everyone else in the camp was guilty, but they were innocent, and they were still strident believers in the communist process. And so, you know, it was a conundrum. Here they are being terribly punished, but by the same token, they're also the perpetrators of their own demise. So how do you deal with them? And they used to play comrades. He said they used to play comrades with people like that and invite them into an ideological discussion about the camp situation and the situation in the country as a whole, and let them rattle out their ideological justifications for everything that had happened in trying to make them parody themselves, roughly speaking. It was a rough game. And Solzhenitsyn also concluded that there was no helping someone like that when they were still ensconced inside that braying ideology. You could predict everything they were going to say. It's like someone had a crank. You could just crank it and out would come the proper ideological formulas. But then he realized that as soon as they, let's call it, repented of that and started to realize their own role in it, or the error of the system, then he would start communicating with them, you know, as if they were people who you could communicate with. Yeah. So that was very interesting as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, this kid is still a little bit human. He starts to cry for his mom, and the coachman basically throws him back into the crate and says that he's not ready yet. And the reason for that is that he still had the power of independent speech. You remember, right at the beginning of the movie, when the mouth was painted on Pinocchio, we saw that mask that was really glaring at the process. And I said that character recurs continually throughout the movie, and this is a good example of that, because the coachman is the enemy of anything that has its own voice. So he's the anti-Geppetto. That's a good way of thinking about it. He's the tyrannical aspect of the culture. But insofar as one of these mostly donkeys, mostly jackasses can still talk, then they're not completely fit for slavery. And you remember this movie was also being made at about the same time that the Nazi transformation of Germany was taking place. And so all these terrible underground things, you know, this process whereby people were being reduced to ideological slaves, say, and in this terrible process that was all playing out in Europe in a very big way. And it's not like people weren't aware of that, you know, it was in the air. So anyways, the donkeys, the jackasses that can still talk, are crying and complaining and repenting, and the coachman turns into a full tyrant again and cracks a whip, if I remember correctly, and says, "You've had your fun and now you're going to pay for it." So the cricket gets word of all this. He gets wind of it. He starts to understand what's happened, is that all these bad kids were enticed out onto this island so that they could be enslaved. And he's really taken aback by that, to say the least. but he realizes what's going on, so he runs back to find Pinocchio. And then the scene switches back to the 8-ball bar where Lampwick is drinking beer and complaining about what the conscience said. You know, because he's kind of guilty and ashamed, but he won't admit it, because he doesn't admit anything. He knows everything. He's not going to admit anything about himself that isn't perfect. He's a real totalitarian in training. And he drinks this beer and he's laughing about the conscience and putting him down. And then he says, well, what does he say exactly? What does he think I am, a jackass or something like that? Maybe that's not the words exactly. And then he grows these ears. And Pinocchio sees that and immediately takes a look at the beer and stops drinking it. And then Lampwick transforms one more time and his face turns into the face of a donkey. And he's laughing still. And then his hands, oh yes, he laughs and he starts to bray like a jackass. And he's horrified by that. And then Pinocchio laughs and the braying comes out as well. And so now they're absolutely horrified. And Lampwick actually figures out what's going on. He figures out that he's been tricked and that he's transforming, and he's completely horrified by it. He becomes conscious of what's happening to him. And there's one particularly, I would say, dramatic scene where his hands have transformed into hooves and he's kicking and leaping around the room in panic, and he comes up to a mirror and sees himself as a jackass, and then he turns around and breaks the mirror. And so, you know, he's self-conscious for a moment, then he destroys his capacity for self-consciousness, then he transforms entirely into a jackass. He's farther down the road than Pinocchio, and he comes crawling to Pinocchio to save him and asks that the conscience comes back so that he can get out of this, but of course it's a bit too late. And so then Pinocchio grows jackass ears, and he's absolutely terrified by it as well. He knows what's coming. And the cricket comes back and guides him off Pleasure Island. And so then they end up on a cliff, because this is an island after all, and they have to jump into the unknown, right? Out of this impulsive, adolescent, hedonic playground into the unknown. And that's how they escape. So that's the first time that Pinocchio has to leave. This is the first scene where he has to jump into the water to make a clean break from something pathological. So tyranny, you see this echoed, you see echoes of this in the story of Moses leading his people from Egypt, because Moses is a master of water, right? He hits a rock with a stick and water comes out of it, and he's floating on water when he's an infant, and he parts the Red Sea. And so he's a master of water and transformation, and the Pharaoh's kingdom is represented as desert stone, roughly speaking. And so the idea there is that, well, the kingdom is solid ground, but it can be a tyranny, and the water is chaos, but it can be the thing that you have to leap into to free yourself from the tyranny. It's not like in the Moses story that comes easy, right? Because the Hebrews leave Israel, or leave Egypt, which is a terrible tyranny. And you think, well, that's good, they've escaped from the tyranny. But that isn't what happens. They escape from the tyranny, they actually end up somewhere arguably worse, because they're wandering around in the desert for 40 years. And it's a brilliant element of that story, because it states clearly that when you go from a bad place to a better place, you go to a worse place first. And it's a great thing to know, because it also tells you why you might be unwilling to take the next step. You know, you're aiming up, but in order to aim up, you have to let go of something you already have. And then that'll put you into a state of chaos. And unless you're willing to undergo that intermediary state of chaos, and you might not recover from it, you're not going to get to the next level. So that's rough. Well, so Pinocchio, he decides that chaos is better than tyranny, and guided by his conscience, jumps into the water. And then we don't see anything happening in the water in this particular scene. They come back to shore all half drowned and exhausted by their adventure, and they go back home. And I think maybe we'll take a break now. Let's see, this is a good time to take a break. 1:30, perfect. So let's break for 15 minutes.